Some of my most vivid memories are the days I spent watching over my baby sister, Shekala, her grubby face smiling up at me as we played peekaboo. She always looked at me with adoring eyes, and it made me feel good to be her protector and hero. In the cooler seasons, Shekala and I spent many nights waiting alone in the chilly house like newly hatched chicks in a nest, wondering if our mother would come home with some food. When no one came, I'd get the bedding out, just a few ragged sheets, and cuddle with her for warmth. During the hot months of the year, my family would join the others with whom we shared the house and gathered together outside in the courtyard, where someone played the harmonium and others sang. I had a real sense of belonging and well-being on those long, warm nights. If there was any milk, the women would bring it out and we children got to share it. The babies were fed first, and if any was left over, the older ones got a taste. I loved the lingering sensation of its sticky sweetness on my tongue. On those evenings I used to gaze upward, amazed at how spectacular the night sky was. Some stars shone brightly in the darkness, while others merely blinked. I wondered why flashes of light would suddenly streak across the sky for no reason at all, making us ooh and ah. Afterward we would all huddle together, bundled up in our bedding on the hard ground, before closing our eyes in sleep. That was in our first house, where I was born, which we shared with another Hindu family. Each group had their own side of a large central room, with brick walls and an unsealed floor made of carpets and mud. It was very simple but certainly no chal. Those warrens of slums where the unfortunate families of the megacities like Mumbai and Delhi find themselves living. Despite the closeness of the quarters, we all got along. My memories of this time are some of my happiest. My mother, Kamala, was a Hindu and my father a Muslim, an unusual marriage at the time, and one that didn't last long. My father spent very little time with us. I later discovered he had taken a second wife, and so my mother raised us by herself. My mother was very beautiful, slender, with long, lustrous black hair. I remember her as the loveliest woman in the world. She had broad shoulders, and limbs made of iron from all her hard work. Her hands and face were tattooed, as was the custom, and most of the time she wore a red sari. I don't remember much about my father, since I only saw him a few times. I do recall that he wore white from top to bottom. His face was square and broad, and his curly dark hair was sprinkled with gray, as well as my mother and my baby sister, Shekala, whose name was Muslim unlike ours. There were also my older brothers, Guddu and Kalu, whom I loved and looked up to. Guddu was tall and slim, with curly black hair down to his shoulders. He was light-skinned, and his face resembled my mother's. Usually he wore short shorts and a white shirt. All our clothes were hand-me-downs from the neighbors, but because of the heat we didn't need much. Kalu was heavier than Guddu, broad from top to bottom, with thin hair. On the other hand, I had short, straight, thick hair, and I was extremely skinny as a child. My face resembled my father's more than my mother's. When my father did live with us, he could be violent, taking his frustrations out on us. Of course, we were helpless, a lone woman and 4 small children. Even after he moved out, he wanted to be rid of us altogether. At the insistence of his new wife, he even tried to force us to leave the area so that he could be free of the burden that our presence brought to bear. But my mother had no money to leave, nowhere to live, and no other way to survive. Her small web of support didn't extend beyond our neighborhood. Eventually, my father and his wife quit the area themselves and moved to another village, which improved things for us a bit. I was too young to understand the separation of my parents. My father simply wasn't around. On a few occasions I found I had been given rubber flip-flops and was told he'd bought new shoes for all of us, but beyond that he didn't help out. The only vivid memory I have of seeing my father was when I was 4 and we all had to go to his house to visit his new baby. It was quite an expedition. My mother got us up and dressed, and we walked in the terrible heat to catch the bus. I remember seeing my mother coming toward me from the outdoor ticket booth, her image hazy in the wavering heat emanating from the tarmac. I kept a particular eye on Shekala, who was exhausted by the sizzling temperature. The bus journey was only a couple of hours, but with the walking and waiting, the journey took all day. There was another hour's walk at the other end, and it was dark by the time we reached the village. We spent the night huddled together in the entranceway of a house owned by some people my mother knew. They had no room inside to offer, but the nights were hot and it wasn't unpleasant. At least we were off the streets. Only the next morning, after we had shared a little bread and milk, I found out that my mother wasn't coming with us. She was not permitted, so we 4 children were escorted up the road by a mutual acquaintance of our parents to our father's place. My mother would wait at her friend's house. Despite all this, or perhaps being oblivious to most of it, I was very happy to see my father when he greeted us at the door. We went inside and saw his new wife and met their baby. It seemed to me his wife was kind to us. She cooked us a nice dinner and we stayed the night there. But in the middle of the night I was shaken awake by Gudu. He said that he and Kalu were sneaking out, and asked if I wanted to come along, but all I wanted to do was sleep. When I woke again, it was to hear my father answering a loud knocking at the front door. A man had seen my brothers running from the village into the open countryside beyond. The man was worried they could be attacked by wild tigers. I later learned that Gudu and Kalu had attempted to run away that night. They were upset by what was happening in our family and wanted to get away from our father and his other wife. Fortunately, they were found later that morning, safe and sound. But one problem morphed into another. The same morning, standing in the street, I saw my father approaching and realized that he was chasing after my mother, with a couple of people following behind him. Not far from me, she suddenly stopped and spun on her heel to face him, and they argued and shouted angrily. Quickly they were joined by other people on both sides. Perhaps their personal argument tapped into the tension between Hindus and Muslims, and it quickly turned into a confrontation. The Hindus lined up with my mother, facing the Muslims, who were aligned with my father. Tempers rose very high, and many insults were exchanged. We children gravitated toward our mother, wondering what would happen with all the shouting and jostling. Then, shockingly, my father hurled a small rock that hit my mother on the head. I was right next to her when it struck her and she fell to her knees, her head bleeding. Luckily, this act of violence seemed to shock the crowds, too, cooling tempers rather than exciting them. As we tended to my mother, the crowd on both sides started to drift away. A Hindu family found the room to take us in for a few days while my mother rested. They told us later that a police officer had taken my father away and locked him up in the cells at the village police station for a day or two. This episode stayed with me as an example of my mother's courage in turning to face down her pursuers, and also of the vulnerability of the poor in India. Really, it was just luck that the crowds backed off. My mother, and perhaps all of us, could easily have been killed. Although we weren't brought up as Muslims, after my father left, my mother moved us to the Muslim side of town, where I spent most of my childhood. She may have felt that we would fare better there, since the neighborhood was a little less destitute. Even after we moved, I don't remember having any religious instruction as a child, other than the occasional visit to the local shrine. But I do remember simply being told one day that I wasn't to play with my old friends anymore because they were Hindus. I had to find new, Muslim, friends. Back then the religions didn't mix, and neither did the people. When we moved to our new house, we all carried everything we owned, which was only some crockery and bedding. I cradled in my arms small items such as a rolling pin and light pots and pans. I was excited about being in a new place, although I didn't really know what was happening. At that point I didn't understand what religion was. I just saw Muslims as people who wore different garments than Hindus. The men dressed all in white and some had long beards, with white hats on their heads. In our second home, we were by ourselves but in more cramped quarters. Our flat was one of 3 on the ground level of a red brick building and so had the same cowpad and mud floor we'd had before. Just a single room. It had a little fireplace in one corner and a clay tank in another for water to drink and sometimes wash with. There was one shelf where we kept our sleeping blankets. Only rich people could afford electricity, so we made do with candlelight. I was afraid of the spiders that would crawl along the wall. There were mice, too, but they didn't bother me the way the insects did. The structure was always falling apart a little. My brothers and I would sometimes pull out a brick and peer outside for fun before putting it back in place. Our town, which I knew as Chinestle, was generally hot and dry, except during the heavy rains of the monsoon. A range of large hills in the distance was the source of the river that ran past the old town walls, and in the monsoon, the river would break its banks and flood the surrounding fields. We used to wait for the river to recede after the rain stopped so we could get back to trying to catch small fish in more manageable waters. In town, the monsoon also meant that the low railway underpass filled with water from the stream it crossed and became unusable. The underpass was a favorite place for the local kids to play, despite the dust and gravel that rained down on us when a train crossed.